Two leading Greek think tanks, ELIAMEP and diaNEOsis, teamed up with the leading think tank in Turkey, Istanbul Policy Center, and two leading polling companies in Greece and Turkey, MRB and Konda, respectively, to track public opinion in our two countries. And we have already presented the two first waves of that project with very interesting findings that have already been aired in previous public presentation events. You can find on our websites. And it's a very pleasure to introduce this third wave, which draws on the experience of on the reality of the Ukraine war, tracking the implications of the war in terms of public opinion stances in Greece and Turkey. These parallel surveys have been implemented through a common questionnaire in two countries, trying to see how the two societies react when faced with common questions. And we view this as an important exercise in mutual understanding between our two societies, and also an exercise of self-awareness for each one of us, each society, each country. In normal times, this is something very important. At times of tension or escalation of bilateral relations, it is even more important. So I'm very happy to be here and to be presenting my colleague from diaNEOsis, Faye Makadasi, to say a few words.
Good morning. Κυρίες και κύριοι, καλημέρα σας. Χαίρομαστε πολύ που είστε σήμερα εδώ μαζί μας. Επίσης, πριν πω δύο λόγια που μάλλον θα επαναλάβω κάποια από αυτά που ήδη είπε ο Γιώργος, να συγχαρώ τον Γενικό Διευθυντή του ELIAMEP, τον Γιώργο τον Παγουλάτο, καθώς και τον επιστημονικό υπεύθυνο του προγράμματος και κύριο ερευνητή, τον Γιάννη τον Γρηγοριάδη, για όλη την έμπνευση, την καθοδήγηση, την επιμέλεια και αυτά τα αποτελέσματα που πραγματικά είναι αρκετά έως πολύ εντυπωσιακά. Είπα αρκετά για να είμαι λίγο πιο φιδωλή. Τώρα, οι ελληνοτουρκικές σχέσεις είναι ένα θέμα πολυσυζητημένο στη χώρα μας, κυρίως στο επίπεδο της πολιτικής, της άμυνας, των γεωπολιτικών σχέσεων, της ενέργειας. Αρκεί κανείς να ανοίξει την τηλεόραση ή μια καθημερινή εφημερίδα και θα δει ότι καταλαμβάνει αρκετό χρόνο και χώρο το θέμα αυτό. Υπάρχει όμως και μια άλλη πολύ σημαντική πτυχή του θέματος και θα έλεγα ήταν πιο αθέατη σε εμάς μέχρι πρότινος, πριν δηλαδή το ELIAMEP με αυτή την μεγάλη ομάδα και την συνεργασία με το Istanbul Policy Center διερευνήσουν αρκετά το θέμα των λαών, των δύο λαών. Οπότε το πρόγραμμα για τις διμερείς σχέσεις Ελλάδας-Τουρκίας, του ELIAMEP, που ξεκίνησε από την αρχή του 2021 με την υποστήριξη του κυρίου Δημήτρη Δασκαλόπουλου, που είναι και ο ιδρυτής του think tank diaNEOsis, και την συνεργασία φυσικά του Istanbul Policy Center, το οποίο θα διαρκέσει μέχρι το τέλος του 2023, σχεδιάζει αυτές τις κυλιόμενες έρευνες κοινής γνώμης που καταγράφουν τις τάσεις, τις απόψεις και τις αντιλήψεις των πολιτών γύρω από τα ελληνοτουρκικά θέματα, τις διμερείς σχέσεις, την εικόνα της μίας χώρας στην άλλη. Τρέχει ταυτόχρονα σε Ελλάδα και Τουρκία και κάποιες από τις ερωτήσεις παραμένουν σταθερές και εξετάζονται και στα κύματα που επαναλαμβάνονται, έτσι ώστε να δημιουργήσουμε μία χρονοσυρά και να υπάρχει η δυνατότητα των διαχρονικών συγκρίσεων. Ευχαριστούμε θερμά τον κύριο Μαύρο από την MRB, καθώς και την Konda για την άρτια υλοποίηση και αυτού του κύματος. Εδώ θα ήθελα να προσθέσω και άλλη μια διάσταση ερευνητική που έχει το πρόγραμμα. Πέραν της ποσοτικής μελέτης και των αποτελεσμάτων που θα δούμε εδώ σήμερα με τους πίνακες, τα διαγράμματα, τις πίτες, και όλο αυτό το πλούσιο υλικό που έχουν ετοιμάσει εδώ οι συνεργάτες μας. Υπάρχει και ένα άλλο σκέλος που είναι το ποιοτικό. Όλοι αντιλαμβανόμαστε, βρισκόμαστε τουλάχιστον σήμερα εδώ, ότι οι διαμορφωτές κοινής γνώμης σε Ελλάδα και Τουρκία αποτελούν τους κρίσιμους συντελεστές για την επιτυχία κάθε προσπάθειας επίλυσης των διαφορών των χωρών. Οπότε το ποιοτικό σκέλος με τις εις βάθος συνεντεύξεις στους opinion leaders είναι πάρα πολύ σημαντικό και έχω τη χαρά σε αυτές τις συνεντεύξεις να συμμετέχω εκ του σύνεγγυς και να επιμελούμαστε επιστημονικά τα παραδοτέα με τον Γιάννη τον Γρηγοριάδη. Οπότε είναι πολύ σημαντικό πώς οι stakeholders, οι opinion leaders βλέπουν την Τουρκία στον κόσμο, ποια θεωρούν ότι είναι η Τουρκία σήμερα και αντίστοιχα ποια είναι η Ελλάδα και πώς βλέπουν την Ελλάδα στον κόσμο, αλλά και ποια θεωρούν ότι είναι η θέση των χωρών στο παγκόσμιο στερέωμα. Επίσης, καταγράφεται και η άποψή τους για το momentum στις ελληνοτουρκικές σχέσεις και την διερεύνηση τυχόν σημείων δυνατής σύγκλησης. Κυρίες και κύριοι, είναι σημαντικό και είμαι σίγουρη ότι αυτό φιλοδοξεί ένας από τους στόχους και της σημερινής μας συνάντησης είναι να καταγράψει τα δυνητικά σημεία σύγκλησης και να διαμορφώσει μια κοινή και αμοιβαία υποφελής ατζέντα που δύναται να επηρεάσει τα κέντρα εξουσίας των δύο χωρών για την αποδοτικότερη διαχείριση των διμερών σχέσεων. Άλλωστε, γίνεται καθημερινά αλλά και διαχρονικά ξεκάθαρο ότι η μη επίλυση των ελληνοτουρκικών διαφορών εγκυμονεί κινδύνους, γι' αυτό είναι αναγκαία η ανάληψη πρωτοβουλειών σαν τη σημερινή, που δύναται να μας διαφωτίσει σχετικά με τις απόψεις και τις αντιλήψεις γύρω από διάφορα κοινά θέματα των δύο λαών. Και να το κάνει αυτό με τρόπο συστηματικό, καθότι, όπως προείπα, για 3 χρόνια θα καταγράψει τα δεδομένα, θα δημιουργηθεί αυτή η κοινή βάση δεδομένων που θα επιτρέπει τις διαχρονικές συγκρίσεις και την παρακολούθηση των τάσεων της ελληνικής και της τουρκικής κοινής γνώμης. Και με αυτές τις σκέψεις και αναγνωρίζοντας ότι η προώθηση και η αναβάθμιση του δημόσιου διαλόγου με well-substantiated data, με εμπεριστατωμένα στοιχεία, είναι το ζητούμενο και των δύο think tanks, θα ήθελα να δηλώσω αισιόδοξη και ότι οι προσδοκίες μας για αυτό το πρόγραμμα θα ικανοποιηθούν στο έπακρο. Και πάλι ευχαριστώ και καλή επιτυχία στη σημερινή συνάντηση.
So I think we can go ahead with our part. Let me welcome you all and thank you for being with us this morning. My name is Ioannis Grigoriadis and I am the head of a Turkey program at ELIAMEP, the associate professor at Bilateral University in Turkey. And I've had the pleasure and honor to co-lead this project together with the colleagues from Istanbul Policy Center, Evren Baltay and Aydın-Düzgit, who are with us this morning. So I do agree with the comments made by Professor Pavlatos and Dr. Makadasi about the significance of this initiative, both because we're trying to add value to the discussion on Greek-Turkish relations by providing high-quality data. Because very often there's a lot of discussion, but little low-quality information and little interaction between key academic institutions and research institutions of the two countries. So we're here in front of you to explore how the Greek and Turkish public opinion views certain important questions. So since this is the third wave, we decided to focus on the effect of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how both societies look into this seminal event, which is transforming regional politics. So we will first have the presentation of the results, and afterwards we will have a panel discussion on the regional implications of of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, but we'll start with the opinion survey itself. I'll first give the floor to Mr. Dimitris Mavros, the managing director of MRB, the Greek opinion poll company who ran the Greek leg of the survey. He will provide us with the data, and then I will interpret the data from the Greek point of view. Then the two colleagues will discuss different aspects of the Turkish side of the sample and the data we have. And finally, Vangelis Areteos, a research associate at the Turkey program, will provide some comments. He will also incorporate the comments of Professor Panagiotta Manoli, who was meant to be with us this morning, but a family emergency did not allow her to be here. And following that, we'll have a discussion, so we can have time to interact. So I'll give first the floor to Dimitris Mavros.
Okay. Καλημέρα σε όλους. Good morning to you all. It is not easy to be able to identify, at least in Greece, I don't know whether this is valid in Turkey, what is actually happening on the spot. In other words, opportunities to be able to identify such sensitive issues in depth and not just for communication reasons. And of course, via a system of trackers. In other words, how things evolve, to understand this evolution, which provides great information against a static image. So we are at the so-called third wave, as Mr. Pagoulatos said, of the Greek-Turkish issues. We heard a lot about the methodology in both countries. So the themes of the two questionnaires were related to some optimism index that we shall see afterwards, or actually it was an index of pessimism, to be honest, against the results as far as the economy and how things are run in both countries, similarities and differences of both countries, Greece and Turkey, against Russia and the United States, because indirectly we can actually understand and decode the so-called similarities instead of asking how much the ones love the country of the other, and we see via other things the so-called issues of similarities. Then we have three evaluations: USA, NATO, EU, as far as the relations between both countries against these institutions, and of course against what has actually happened in Ukraine. And last but not least, we also see in depth the so-called Russian issue, because as you understand, we are dealing with countries which love or hate, let's say, Russia, and some, let's say, confrontations, if I dare to say, some distances against what is happening between Russia and Ukraine. So the first graph is related to the so-called pessimism, to be honest, and not optimism, because as you can see, the climax is how things are going in our country general, how well or bad. So as these are majority figures, we saw that the not that well, we see some comparative data against 21, the 22, beginning of 22, and now, where we have the things which evolve in 2022, and we see in both countries, Greece and Turkey, there is a growth trend of the so-called bad. As far as Greece is concerned, we see a linear growth from 51, 52, 54%, where the two opposites show a transformation of 110%, whereas for Turkey, things is not that graphic. We see an accelerated trend in 2022 in the second measurement and tracker, and the growth index from against 2021 is 30% higher, 129%. So we see that things in Turkey, according to our study, and I believe that colleagues will interpret things even better to understand the impact that this worsening of the general trend in Turkey has. Now, let's talk about the economy. Now, we're talking about the perceptions about the next year. We're talking about the situation of the country and the financial situation of the country and the personal financial situation, where once again we have the so-called negative scenario, in other words, where things will get even worse. And we see that for both countries, starting from the state finances, Greece from 55 goes to 61%. Turkey goes from 51 to 58%. So growth rate in Greece is 7%, whereas growth rate in Turkey is worsening is 37%. Now, as far as the personal financial status is concerned, is multilateral, multidimensional. There are two factors that we need to consider. First of all, has to do with stagnant or worsening. Now, in 2021, in Greece, stagnant was the majority vote, the majority opinion against worsening, but today we see a cross data. In other words, we see that worsening is ranked first, is 47%, and stagnant fell to 36%. In Turkey, things are not similar. The worsening was and still is first, 31 against 41, and the ratio is actually changed. Now, in both cases, the stagnation/worsening is 83-84%, whereas in Turkey is higher, is 77, around between 77 and 80, says the speaker. Now, so we're dealing with a trend with both countries are struggling, but it seems that Turkey, let's say, struggles more, suffers more. And now, let's to see how people identify security in both countries. And it seems that health, the so-called health security, is in both countries ranked first, with a significant difference, of course. National security is ranked second in both countries. The job security, or job issues, is also very close, ranked third in both countries. And then we have a battery between financial security, individual security, and something rather new that we shall see in the years to come, issues related to food security, that at least according to media, affect people's psychology. But what is also important to see and understand is that in Greece, we offer greater importance by feeling more financial security. You see the ratio between Greece and Turkey, 34 against 25, whereas as far as food security is concerned and food issues, is the exact opposite. Turkey, 32.3%, Greece, 22.5%. So Turkey offers great importance to food security against Greece. Let me just clean up the graph so you can see it more clearly. So these two factors, these two denominators, is a great difference between Greece and Turkey. So we want pocket security or financial security, if you wish, whereas our neighbors, Turkish people, in other words, need and demand food security. And now we enter in a more qualitative approach, where we see a battery, I would say, between rational but more political issues, as far as where are the similarities between both countries, Greece and Turkey, in other words. Blue stands for we resemble with the United States, and red is we resemble with Russia. And you can actually see, as far as security, foreign policy, and standard of living is concerned, we see a similarity with the US model. Leaving aside one factor, which is the standard of living, where they choose something in between and they say, I don't really know. We are in between USA and Russia. Turkey, on the other hand, you can see that in any given aspect or pillar, security, foreign policy, standard of living, way of life, is black, which means I don't know, I don't answer. So Turkish people cannot decide whether they find any similarities between either United States or Russia. And this, as I said, is identified in all factors. Now, Greece, as I said, we have the so-called family values, and this is important. You see the mental difference between the two people. Civilization or culture, to be honest, as a speaker, and religion. We are, let's say, Russians, we as Greeks. And I'm quite impressed with this particular data, and we shall interpret it afterwards, because I said that all the lower part of the graph have to do with the so-called intangible dimensions, why the lifestyle differs between the two countries.
So, moving on.
So, to continue, to which country, to which institution, we see that the interests of both countries are more safe and secure. And Greeks say the system in which they feel more safe is the EU. 54% the guarantees offered to Greek interests. Against Turkey, where their national interests are more guaranteed via Germany with 35.5%, which means, in other words, we have a multi-answer question.
All of them or some of them, not just one answer. Okay, that's why we have that big figure here and a smaller one here. I would like to have comments on that. Okay? So, first indications. Greeks are closer to EU, Turkey is closer to Germany. Not very far, of course, from EU, it's okay. Απόψεις για τη θέση της Ελλάδας και της Τουρκίας.
Now, opinions about both countries and the countries they would like to wish to live abroad. Now, talking about this position, both people, Greeks and Turks, what do you actually think? How can we interpret this figure, this percentage? It seems that the EU is in a good position. Lifestyle is nice. So we have one out of three citizens of this country that don't want to leave the country, and all of a sudden, the comparison between this and the other creates a huge gap. But of course, a in-depth analysis could actually showcase that it is very far away from us because they don't want to live there, because they won't have access to my country of origin. And there is also another data which has a growth trend for Turks, which is a Muslim country, of course.
Low for both countries. Πηγαίνοντας από την άλλη μεριά,
going on the other side, as far as opinions they find more similarities, they say that whether Greece or Turkey is a Western country, and we see that Greeks feel 60% that it is a Western country, whereas Turks believe that the percentage is around 30%. So, in this issue, we share the same position. In other words, the cultural standards of Western countries and of West, they threat the Greek and Turkish lifestyle, which, of course, as we're concerned, is less than 60%, but for Turkey is more than 30%. And last but not least, the so-called Greek-Turkish democracy, where they should comply with the Western standards. Though we are considered as a Western country, we do not want to comply with Western standards. Whereas Turkey, although they do not feel such a, let's say, Western countries, they more believe that they should comply with Western standards. We see this cross data in this particular study between both countries, which is quite important culturally and politically is concerned. Now, let's talk about the relations between US, NATO, and EU. So you see that evaluation over here, the so-called mostly and somewhat, somehow negative. And for USA, Greeks, 54% negative, and neutral 26%, whereas Turkish, 65%, and all the others are very lean as far as percentages are concerned. Now, as far as NATO is concerned, we attribute 43% and quite rather important neutral opinion about NATO. And neutral could be added in this particular part of the graph, and not just in a so-called somewhat mostly negative. For questions of political correctness, we should leave it as such, standing alone, in other words. So we have a less negative opinion from NATO against the USA, 10% actually. And as far as EU is concerned, we have these two crucial percentages that, to be honest, this also gives an indication about the other one. Now, in Turkey, we have 65, 47, 47, negative or somewhat negative for the three actors, which is a more, let's say, robust image and perception, whereas we as Greeks, we have the so-called in-between as far as evaluation of EU is concerned. Opinions, opinions, opinions, and views. So let's start with the first battery as far as views is concerned. United States should not play a role in EU security. They should not play a role in EU security, and their presence creates more confrontations and conflicts and insecurity. The 51% of Greeks, 48% of Turks believe that. Now, United States support Turkey or Greece against Greece or against Turkey. So 47% of Greeks believe that USA, they support Turkey against Greece, and conversely. So percentages are quite similar as far as these views are concerned. The cooperation with USA reinforces Greek-Turkish security. So Greeks, although on the other question they said that the US, they also have a level playing field with Turks, it seems that they have a greater support of US is concerned against Turks. That's what Turks believe. So the hegemony of West is shrunk, and this is an important issue that that advanced scholars and specialized scholars understand in order to inform the actors, and it's very important fact, despite you might think it's boring. United States is a natural partner of security in EU, and their presence contributes to establishment of peace. 26% is good for Greeks, 18% for Turks. And let's go to views about NATO. Greece or Turkey, respectively, should have an independent foreign policy. Wow. The difference is crucial. 62 against 81% is around 20 percentage units of difference.
I was saying this is the most important because it's the only national consensus that the Turks have in this data with this highest.
Okay.
Yes.
Η συνεργασία με το ενισχύει την ελληνική ή την τουρκική.
Reinforces the situation. 48% of Greeks believe that NATO supports the EU security, and 41% goes for Turkey. NATO should grow whenever there are countries who are willing to participate in the alliance. 1 out of 3 people believe that. The participation of Turkey and supports the resolution for the confrontation between Greeks and Turks, 1 out of 4. One might believe that the rest do not believe that this is a factor of peace. This is quite important. I want Greece and Turkey out of NATO. But we're not but people both of us, to say that we want to leave NATO. Okay? I don't know, this is once again political correctness. Is it a reality? Is what they actually believe? Now, the connotation leads to interpretations. Now, and as far as EU is concerned, the process of annexation of Turkey in the EU has contributed to the resolution of issues between Greece and Turkey. As far as I'm concerned, none of Greeks or Turks believe that. And Turkey, and respectively Greece, once again in a cross-reference, enjoy unconditional or unfair support from the EU against Greece or against, if you wish, Turkey. So 59% of Greeks believe that Turkey enjoys unfair support from the EU. And 55% of Turks believe that Greece enjoys unconditional or unfair support from the EU. Okay? Now, the war in Ukraine. Now, responsible for the war in Ukraine, 60% for Greeks is Russia, 72% Turks, for Turks, and US 50% for Greeks and 60% for Turks. So it seems that Russia and US for Turks and Greeks are to blame for the war in Ukraine. So in Ukraine and NATO have a slightly higher percentages. So who is more pro-Russian or, let's say, hidden pro-Russian? And it's not the only study, I apologize for that, Mr. Pagoulatos, but we have quite some data about who is actually pro-Russian. As I said, secretly pro-Russian as peoples are concerned. Now, Russia is a security threat for the EU, and we need an alliance of security. Who should face that? 32 against 29. Russia should be considered a partner in European security and brought into European security structures. 53% against 24%. And Turks, they declare
don't want to have an opinion. Η διεύρυνση του ΝΑΤΟ.
Now, as far as the expansion of NATO is concerned, we want to see whether this creates what 54% believe that, 35% of Turks. The strong leadership of President Putin is the right model of governance. No. No for Greeks. Not that aggressive against Putin on behalf of Turks. And we can clearly understand why. Mr. Putin, in 2016, he was the first international leader in Greece, the most popular against any other international leader back then, in 2016. He was the most popular leader in Greece against the US president, German chancellor. By far, he was ranked first. And since then, now he's third from the bottom. And views on the war in Ukraine, the role of Russia. Russia has crucial cultural relations with Greece, 61%, whereas Turkey, 31%. Russia can contribute to the resolution of Greek-Turkish disputes, 39% against 24%. Russia is a key strategic partner for Greece, 34%, for Turkey, 51%. Allow me to reiterate, Russia has strong cultural links with Greece, and on the lower part, we talk about strategic partner for Greece or Turkey. So culture on the one hand, partner on the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, I'm okay.
It's okay?
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ. I will now move with the presentation, since Mr. Mavros' presentation took a bit longer than expected. My presentation will be a bit shorter, so we have enough time for two colleagues to present their position too. I will try to provide some comments on the very interesting data that we've been watching together here. I think the first interesting observation is that discrepancy between the government policies and the public opinion views in the two countries. So you can see that the Greek public opinion is much more pro-Russian on certain important issues than the Turkish public opinion, but the government policy is completely different. Greece has taken a clear position along the side of the international community and the Western community as far as the Russia's invasion of Ukraine is concerned. So there is an interesting, let's say, opposition of public opinion perceptions and the government policies in that respect. But what is also interesting is to see that the appeal of President Putin in the Greek public has been sharply falling.
Yeah.
So there is some cost by what is happening there. On the other hand, I think there are some other important contradictions or tensions in the data that have been presented. So this existence of strong cultural bonds on the one side, but recognition that Russia is not a strategic partner for Greece. Greece is a member of the Western community. So Greece feels, the majority of Greeks feel that they're part of the West. But what is interesting is that they don't feel part of the Western security community. So when it comes to NATO questions or whether Russia is a threat for the West, for the European Union, for the European continent, here we see some interesting discrepancies from what we have expected from a country that considers itself to be an integral part of the West. And I think that there are interesting observations that our data help us shed some light on this issue. If you look into the deeper details of this, you'll see that pro-Russia positions in Greece are likely to be on the right and left-wing extremes of the political spectrum. So left and far left-wing supporters and far right-wing supporters are more likely to be pro-Russian than the center voters or the liberal voters. So there is some sort of consensus that is developing on the edges of the Greek political spectrum. And of course, you can think about that in terms of history. Russia has always played an important role in the Greek nation-building process, in the national psyche. It is a sort of the orthodox country that was meant to help the Greeks gain their freedom from the Ottoman Empire, although it was actually the Western powers that delivered this, not Russia, in a sort of, in the longer term. Of course, Russia was present in the Navarino battle, but historically, Greece became a part of the Western political and security community. But these affinities remains very strong. And of course, the role of the Orthodox Church is important. And of course, there you can highlight another interesting discrepancy. The Ecumenical Patriarchate, which is based in Turkey, has been taken always a position that tries to sort of highlight the non-national element of Orthodox Christianity and try to highlight a more cosmopolitan view, while the Russian Church, the Russian Patriarchate, has been allying itself with Greek nationalist Orthodox circles in Greece, even against the Patriarchate. And of course, the Ukraine was an interesting theater of that confrontation even before the war started. So there was a big controversy regarding the status of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that to some degree predated the conflict that we're witnessing right now. So on the other hand, of course, there is this affinity, and we ask this question. Russia still, for many Greeks, is considered to be represent the values of the Soviet Union, so they kind of link communism and this left-wing identification with Russia today. So this is another sort of reason for this sympathy. And of course, we can also add to that Russia has been very actively promoting its position in the public sphere of Greece over the last decades. So that's important to highlight that Russian soft power has been quite important in Greece. So we can witness that in these findings. So another interesting point that I would like to raise before I conclude my presentation is this mistrust against the international community. That's a common feature in Greece and Turkey. So both countries, people think that the international community is unfairly treating them and support the other in that case. I think this has to do with the way the education systems have been developing the view of oneself in the world. So there is some certain element of exceptionalism that has been cultivated. And I think Greece and Turkey are not different in that respect. So it is strong. And of course, it is something that helps us understand why sometimes conflict resolution can become more difficult, right? Because if you have very little trust in any actors that can help bring about change and kind of restructure a certain set of dispute in a way that can be resolved, this makes things much more difficult. So I will conclude with a point that Mr. Mavro said, this overall pessimism that has become quite strong. I think, of course, this has to be linked with the economic turmoil that the pandemic produced. Now the war is producing an additional negative effect on the economic conditions. So this is something that we need to highlight. And of course, the same problems exist in Turkey and even more to some degree, as our data has shown. So I'll stop here and I'll give the floor to Evren Balta first.
Thank you.
He's a professor of international relations at Nursic University and a senior scholar in Istanbul Policy Center.
Thank you. I have a presentation as well, but let me start by saying that the impression that I get from the data is this pessimism that you're talking about, deep suspicions, in-betweenness, undecisiveness. I mean, even the fact that 50% of the Turks kept saying that I have no idea to the questions about whether Turkey belongs to Russia and the United States really means something. And we did not, I mean, we did two prior waves of the survey, and we didn't come across such a thing. I mean, they were responding to the Turkish foreign policy. So what we have been seeing is this disinterest to the foreign policy issues mainly. And you can also see it when you look at the security issues, which types of security issues matter either to the Greek or Turkish public. They are basically in the survival mode. They are basically caring about the health security, food security, individual security, employment, economics, finance, but national security, which used to be really high for the societies in good times, now is basically losing its importance, which I think is an important component of this third waves. We keep finding the same thing in the surveys, if I'm not mistaken. So this is all happening, as I said, in a period of pessimism and increased unhappiness in both countries, but which is more sharper in Turkey. So what I want to do here is that in the first two waves, we also did the same thing. The averages, we thought, don't tell us much in Turkey, for the Turkish society, which is very polarized. And when I say polarized, basically, let me show you this. The first two waves told us that it's the bipartisan partisan identities, the political party support that really shapes the attitudes, and also religion and education that shapes the attitudes, either towards the Greeks or towards the foreign policy issues or anything. Anything that comes up to your mind, it really is being shaped by partisanship, which political party, which either opposition or government, which side basically you're supporting. So the education and the religiosity basically informing partisanship as well, so they basically work together. So you have education, religiosity, and partisanship, but most important is, I would say, partisanship. I tried to group the data in terms of, because we are basically dealing in this way with anti-Westernism, but there are different types of West in the minds of both Greek and Turkish public. And I tried to group this data to the geopolitical West, which means, for example, American presence in the region or relations with the US and this and that, to institutional West, membership to EU, membership to NATO. And what we have heard from the first presentation of the results, these countries do not even trust to the institutions they belong. I mean, Greeks do not trust completely to EU, Turks don't trust to NATO, both of them don't trust to NATO. I mean, the percentage is maybe sometimes 40%, but it's still low because you're a member to this institution and you don't trust the institution that you are a member. And finally, perceptions of the cultural West, which is completely different. And I think what is important for the Turkish data is how this idea of geopolitical and institutional West and cultural West is different from each other. And finally, Russia's challenge to the West, how is it perceived? And I'm not able to read the numbers. They are very small, very, very difficult to read from here, but I'll just try to improvise. When we look at the perceptions of the US, what we see is that, and I have Cumhur İttifakı, government and opposition, you have sort of a consensus in terms of their perceptions towards the West. But, and there is the role of the US in the world. They do not think that it's highly negative, their perception. And then you have the US support of Greece at the expense of Turkey. Let me not just go in detail, but what you see is that when it comes to the US, maybe the HDP, the Kurds' attitude is a little bit different, but Millet and Cumhur İttifakı, the government and opposition, are similar in terms of their perceptions of the US. When you come to the perceptions of NATO, it seems that opposition has more favorable views of NATO than the government. When we talk about the role of the EU, right? I mean, when it comes to the EU, opposition definitely has more favorable views than the government supporters. So, but the divergence is not that big. And about the NATO, one interesting fact is that, let me go back, I'm sorry. One important fact is that HDP, who is, or the Kurdish voters, let me say, who are more pro-US, becomes less pro-NATO. So they favor US presence, but do not favor NATO. So that difference I also thought very important in terms of the Kurdish politics as well. And this is the cultural West, which I thought very important, which is the major difference. I mean, when it comes to the US, NATO, so the opposition and government supporters have similar attitudes. When it comes to the EU, there is a little bit of divergence. The opposition voters supporting EU more than the government supporters. But when it comes to the cultural West, meaning that whether Turkey is a Western country, whether Turkish democracy should comply to the standards of the Western democracy, whether Western cultural norms are threatening Turkey or not, opposition is definitely culturally Western. And the difference is huge. And it shows that the West is basically about, or the Western identity is basically, or the Western presence, or anti-Westernism here comes a lot about Turkish identity, how you see your identity, and basically aligning with the West in terms of the culture, not just the culture, but the institutions of the West really is something that opposition is discursively using a lot as well at the elite level too. How the Russia's challenge is perceived, I mean, we discussed about that. Even though we have been talking about Turkey shifting access from West to Russia, you don't see in the public opinion. What do you see, as I said when you were talking, is this independent foreign policy dimension, Turkey being an autonomous country, Turkey being a unique country, which became a consensus among both the opposition and government voters. I mean, it's like 87% something, which was the highest percentage that we got in any of these surveys, probably. Turkey is an independent foreign policy. So this autonomy or this independence has become really important for Turks. When we compare the averages as well, the approval of Russia is not that high. Turks see it as a strategic partner. They do think most of the pro-government voters think that Putin's leadership style is very good because it's very similar to Erdogan's style. I mean, it's not the approval of Putin, but it's approval of a certain style,
yes.
basically.
You're right.
But in terms of that, they just acknowledge Russia is a strategic partner, but not more than that. And even Russia's role in the European security structure, for example, less than the Greeks' support of Russia's presence in the EU. In the European security structure. So what you see is that I don't see in these results a shift of axis, but more emphasis on autonomy. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Evren.
Thank you.
I'll the floor to Senem Aydın-Düzgit, who is a Research and Academic Affairs Coordinator in Istanbul Policy Center and a professor at Sabancı University. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Ioannis. It's very nice to be here. And okay, I think this is better now, right? And I'm very happy that this cooperation between IPC and ELIAMEP is progressing very well, and that we actually get to undertake these studies, which I think are very important, not just to understand the nature of bilateral perceptions and relations, but also of some of the overall, growing trends in the region and beyond. Now, speaking of these, growing trends, we've all seen the data, we've heard some of the interpretation, and I think this is pointing to one thing that we should acknowledge. This is that we have a problem of anti-Westernism, creeping and rising, and not just in the global south, right? Because whenever we talk about anti-Westernism, whenever we academics look at the literature on this, we usually see that this is discussed in relation to Russia or the global south, and the so-called non-West, however you might be defining it. But I think we are now seeing it, observing it, and living through it in the West itself, and the West as we know it. Now, what do I mean by this notion of anti-Westernism? Of course, it's closely connected to anti-Americanism, but not exclusively about that. And, some things that Evren has already said about this, but I'm going to dig a little bit deeper. Now, I think this has existed for quite a while, but I think we see that it's becoming more and more visible, especially after the war in Ukraine. And especially that the war in Ukraine is taking longer than expected and will probably take much longer than anticipated or hoped. This comes in different shapes and colors, I think, and there are different drivers in each context, that is in the Turkish context and also in the Greek context. Now, when you look at, what kind of was quite puzzling to me. Now, from the Turkish perspective, I wasn't very puzzled by the results, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why, that I don't find it extremely puzzling. But in the Greek case, I was a little bit puzzled to see that, because Greece is an EU member state, yet it only views, the 53% view the European Union as a guarantor of Greek safety and security, etc., against security threats. And similarly, the anti-US attitude seems to be also quite high in the Greek context. So there is a certain sense, a strong sense, I would say, of resentment and disillusionment, both in Greece and in Turkey. Now, why could that be the case? Now, of course, we don't look at this in the data, but we can speculate. And I think here we have certain historical drivers, but also certain contemporary drivers that's driving this process at the same time. Now, I don't want to comment too much on the Greek case. I'm sure there are so many of you here that are better positioned to do this than I can. But to me, and what I gather from the data, of course, here you have certain cultural dispositions, the cultural notion of the West, that's a key driver here, certain historical dispositions. But also, as a scholar of European integration myself, I also see certain more recent developments, particularly the euro crisis. I think we haven't mentioned it so far, and the austerity policies led by Germany that has been imposed on this country, that I would say might have had a lasting impact on certain views regarding Europe, but also certain views regarding Germany, which seem to be quite negative. That at least that's what came out of the data. Now, in the Turkish case, of course, you have different sets of drivers. Now, identity, polarization, all mentioned by Evren, and I agree with all that. In the Turkish case, perhaps also for the Greek case as well, the United States factor, I think, should also be highlighted. And by that, I mean US foreign policy in the past, US foreign policy in Iraq, US foreign policy in Afghanistan, all the failures and the crises that they led to, this all fed into anti-Americanism. In the Turkish case, we know that it has. And I would argue, I don't have data for this, but this might be the case for Greece and perhaps other European countries also. In the Turkish case, more specifically, of course, United States is also linked with some of the domestic issues and domestic troubles as well, which feeds into rising anti-Americanism, both across the left and also the right, that don't usually see eye to eye these days because of polarization, but definitely do converge on some issues regarding perceptions on US and NATO. And of course, I mean, when I refer to such domestic developments, the one thing that comes to mind, for instance, is the failed coup attempt in 2016, how United States in the Turkish psyche, imaginary perception, is seen to be associated with that. So there is this feeling that United States and America in general, works to the detriment of Turkish interests, including NATO as well. And this feeling is strong. In the Turkish case, of course, a lot of mistrust towards the EU as well, which is understood because of the failed accession perspective, because of the current tensions over the Eastern Mediterranean, etc. But here, as opposed to Greece, of course, Germany sticks out as a country with which Turkey seems to have a more positive perception of. And here I would say we have a sort of an opposite dynamic regarding perceptions towards Greece, Germany and France. Taking a reverse position in the Greek public opinion as opposed to the Turkish public opinion. And in the Turkish public opinion, again, I don't know, I will have to speculate, but my hunch is that this has something to do with the way in which the former Chancellor Merkel and Erdogan had established quite a close relationship, the way in which this was covered in Turkish media, especially in pro-governmental media. The perception that when it comes to, for instance, these foreign policy disputes like the Eastern Mediterranean, countries like Germany usually seem to play a more moderating or a facilitating role, etc. So, and of course, the historical bilateral relationship between Turkey and Germany, that goes pretty deep because of the German Turks, but also economic ties, etc., that play into the relationship. So overall, I would say that the individual views of these countries are important. The societal trends here are important. Bilateral views in these countries towards the societies of one another are definitely important. But I think this data, perhaps more importantly, is showing us, what it's showing us is that we have a larger problem at stake that is larger than Turkey, that is larger than Greece, which is this rising ambivalence, if not outright hostility, towards this notion of the West. And this is important because it's not unique to Turkey and Greece. The drivers might be different, but the symptoms are similar. You see it in Hungary, you see it in the Balkans, you even see it in core Europe and not just the periphery of Europe. So, and of course, as well as across the global South, right? Because we often, in Europe, there is this sort of so-called, I would say, a more Eurocentric Western bubble, which, relies on understanding that everything and all the perceptions are somehow aligned. Let's say when it comes to the war in Ukraine, let's say when it comes to the Russian aggression. That is not necessarily the case in India. That's not necessarily the case in Brazil. That's not necessarily the case in Turkey and Greece, these countries that are members of some of the key institutions of the European security order and the Western security order. And this is important because I think this has implications for the fate of the so-called liberal international order, which is being, undermined, obviously, from within many of these countries, but also outside. And it means that this situation requires political factions in Europe to take this growing resentment into account. And to do that, of course, you need to decenter from this sort of European, Western-centric perception of Russia, of the war and how the rest of the world actually are in tune with this vision or not. So let me just stop there and maybe discuss further when we have questions.
Thank you very much, Senem. Now I'll invite Vangelis Areteos, who is a research associate at the Turkey program at ELIAMEP, to offer his comments.
Thank you very much all for coming. So, from this third wave, what we can see for both Greece and Turkey, and by the way, as Ioannis said, our colleague Panayota Manoli is not here, so when I will be referring to Greece, it will be more what Panayota said and we discussed. So I'm speaking on her name also. So what we see from this third wave is when it comes to Greece, we see an exceptionalism, a feeling that Greece and Greek culture is exceptional. And this, we saw it quite clearly when it comes to family values, that we feel more closer to Russia, which means that we are not part of the family values of the West, of the Western world, and also the culture. So we see from the point of Greece this feeling of exceptionalism, and from the point of Turkey we see a feeling of uniqueness. That Turkey is a unique country, and that's why we have, as we saw the results, a rather balanced view concerning of the Turks concerning United States and Russia. They don't pick sides. They want to be somewhere in the middle, and actually they want to be in the middle because they feel unique. And this, we could see it also by the fact that when we have these questions about security, about what the most common things between the United States, to choose between the United States and Russia, when it comes to security, foreign policy, almost everything, the rates of the Turks who don't answer or they don't know are amazingly high. So we have something like between 44 and 47% of people in Turkey who didn't reply. Whereas, for example, the Greek side is something between 17 and 7%. So why do we have all those Turks who don't reply? We could eventually speculate that there are maybe two reasons. The first reason is exactly this feeling of uniqueness, that we are so unique, so we don't have to choose, we don't have to pick sides, we don't have to find common things with others because we are unique. And the other possible explanation, and one doesn't exclude the other, is that, and we've seen it practically also, is that much less Turks follow foreign policy in daily basis as we follow foreign policy in Greece. Also, we can see this exceptionalism, and here I will use a term that Senem has formulated, this de-Europeanization. Yeah. And we see it, for example, very clearly in the Greek side, where when it comes to if Greece is a Western country or not, more young people feel that Greece is not a Western country than older people. So we see that we are slowly in Greece, and we've seen it also with other data, all these discrepancies between being within EU or with the United States when it comes to security or foreign policy, but not feeling part of it. All this data that shows that we are, the Greeks feel a sort of deception from the EU as they perceive it supports Turkey. So we have a slow process of de-Europeanization in Greece, more psychological, more cultural. It's not about politics. Whereas in the Turkish case, it's much more interesting, I would say, because we cannot really talk about the EU losing its soft power. Because as Evren showed, when it comes to EU and Western values and everything, the opposition is much more positive towards all these principles, the Europe, democracy, than the supporters of the government. And this is because, again, we are in the middle of an identity struggle or war in Turkey. And for the opposition, the EU mainly, and the West in general, but the EU as a cultural entity, but also as an institution, represents a sort of coming back to what Turkey used to be. It's much more cultural, it's much more, has to do about identity first, it's more psychological. So the people of the opposition would like to feel closer to the EU, to feel that Turkey is becoming again more European, more Western oriented, because they perceive that with the current government this traditional orientation of Turkey has been lost. But also, practically speaking, because, and this we can see it also by the statements, but mainly about from the behavior of the leadership of parties, of the opposition parties, but also as we've seen the basis, is because they know that after the elections, if they come to power, they will have to restore, as they say, the regime and come back to the parliamentary democracy and generally, as they say, restore Turkey. And the only way they can do it is through the EU. So within Turkey, EU is, and as a general principle, I mean, of course, very few people still believe that Turkey can be a full member one day and everything. But as a weight, as a factor that can lead politics and identity politics, EU is still very important in Turkey. Whereas, as I said, in Greece, we see, I wouldn't say the opposite, but we see a feeling more pronounced of deception from the EU for various reasons. What we also see is that when it comes to what Evren said about HTP and NATO and the US, and this is indeed a very, very interesting finding concerning the Kurdish politics, but also the mindset in Turkey. And we saw it also in some other data between the parties, is that in Turkey, US is one thing and NATO is another thing. Traditionally, NATO was associated with the state. So for the Turks, the perception of the Turks, when we talk about NATO, we talk about this very strong relationship between NATO and the Turkish state. And this we see it clearly with the discrepancy of HDP voters, because whereas they are much more in favor of the US, which is very normal today in the current situation, because the US is more implicated in northern Syria with the Kurds there. So whereas traditionally for the Kurds and HDP, and even ideologically, the US were always seen as almost an enemy, now we see a different perception. But NATO remains very low because of this idea that NATO is the state. So for the Kurds, it's the Turkish state. So they keep their distances. So this I think is very, very interesting to see also the perception. Now, we are talking about Greek exceptionalism, Greek Turkish uniqueness, but there is a common point there. And this common point is this independent foreign policy. And this is very interesting because, of course, we have a difference, about 20%, if I'm not mistaken, between 25% between Greeks and Turks. So less Greeks want Greece to have an independent foreign policy, but still, it's the majority. Of course, in Turkey, this figure is much higher. It can be explained by this feeling of uniqueness. But also exceptionalism pushes also the Greek public, to desire a more independent foreign policy. And there also we see that whereas in the Greek case, We have the people desiring a more independent foreign policy. They have much more positive views on Russia than the government. Then there is a big discrepancy between what people feel and think and what the Greek government does, because the Greek government has completely allied with the West in this Ukraine crisis, whereas the Greek public is much more, let's say, nuanced, and their heart is not in there. And it's very interesting to say, because one of the biggest criticisms that we have here in Greece from the media mainly, but also from the political world towards Turkey, is that, well, Erdogan and Turkey, they want to have an independent foreign policy, they want to be with the States and the Russians and everything. And actually, the Greek people would almost like the Greek government to do what the Turkish government does. So this is a very interesting finding also. Now, when it comes to Turkey, what we see is this feeling of uniqueness again, and we saw it in all data, is that there is no one, even the opposition, government supporters, no one is picking sides. We didn't see big percentages, people for the US or for Russia. So this survey really shows practically and confirms what we see on the ground the last period, that Turkey didn't shift, as Evren said. We don't have this Eurasianist shift or whatever. It's a different thing. Turkey wants to be somewhere on its own because Turkey feels unique. So
are we done?
We are done? Yeah. Okay.
Very good.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you very much, Vangeli. We have 10 minutes, approximately 10 minutes for discussion. So if you want to raise any questions, please identify yourself and address it to the speakers, please.
Antonis Papagiannidis.
My name is Adonis Papagiannidis.
Think that the West is Western. I raise this issue because I understand that Russia today is an awful medium. Sputnik is not reliable. But from there to ban them, let's say to ban in Russia CBS or to ban BBC, it would be understandable in Russia because Russia is not Western, is it? But to have media banned in the West is not exactly my concept of Westernness. Then again, I'm extremely rich, fabulously rich, and I'm very close to a dictator, to an awful dictator. So my assets are frozen. I understand it. The dictator's assets too. But now I think I've heard that a Western power goes further from seizing my assets. They're going to sell them out to give compensation to poor people dominated and killed by the awful dictator. Is that exactly your conception of Western? And so on and so forth. So is the West really Western? Or are we all shifting towards something that would be deeply understandable, not to President Putin, he's a bad man, but to President Xi, he's there, over there.
Would anybody like to?
I have a complementary addition, add-on to the previous question, which is connected with the following. You mentioned that there is an anti-Western movement in the planet, not only in Greece or in Turkey. Are we sure that we are talking about an anti-Western movement or an anti-systemic movement? And the systemic could be, a common dominator in all the countries. Because if you put the question or the concept as anti-Western, then you cannot describe or explain what happens in other places in the world. So from our perception, at least coming from what we see in Greece or in other countries around Greece, is that probably we are talking about an anti-systemic concept and not an anti-Western.
There are other questions, so we can bundle them and then, yes?
No one?
Here, please.
Thank you. I'm Lina Skarstonaitė, Lithuanian ambassador. I would like to ask the last presenter to elaborate a bit on this uniqueness of texts and exceptionalism of Greeks. What's the difference? For me, the two words, they sound like, they are the same word, but put in different perspectives. So what are the perspectives of that? Thank you.
Yes, and the gentleman.
Represent the order.
Hello, Alessandro Dudino from the Italian Embassy. You have told before that in Greece, the extremes identify more with Russia, but at the same time, we have a data of 52% of respondents saying that Russia should be part of the European security. I was wondering whether you have also the disaggregated data on who is supporting Russia part of security within each party. And I would like to build up also on the exceptionalism, because it's quite strange for me that, not strange because I've been here for 3 years, but it still puzzles me that the Greek public sees that a more independent foreign policy would be more beneficial to their interests than being part of EU or NATO.
Thank you. And our last question from Dr. Mainardus here.
Yes, my name is Ronald Mainardus. I'm a research fellow at ELIAMEP. I have a methodological question regarding this whole project. So we're discussing public opinion and bilateral relations. My question is, what effect does the public opinion have on the actual politics? To what extent are the governments in both countries, because this is the idea behind the whole project, to improve the relations between Athens and Ankara, I assume. To what extent are the governments influenced by all this? Cannot a government have a policy which is totally contrary to the public opinion? Please.
So, would you like to respond?
I can answer that.
Yes.
Well, the point is that normally, which is not frequently, the Greek government at least would like to know what people believe, not to do what people say, but in order to understand how high is the upper limit regarding communication terms when they want to persuade people that the good for them is something different compared what people have in their minds. And I think that this is right, because you have to know not just to do what they say, but in order to design your communication plan so you can have people with you. And this is appropriate, I think.
So,
May I just add to that? I think that's an important question in how much the public opinion really shapes the government policy. And there are two components of that question, I think. On the one hand, majority of the governments right now basically rule by figures. They go to the public opinion polls, they check, as you have been saying, what the public thinks about a certain issue. And in order to win elections, given that these are the governments who are designed to win elections, not authoritarian systems, so public opinion polls really provide them important data in how much they can go and what types of policies that they should be favoring. But on the other side, specifically in countries like Turkey, where the media is controlled a lot, where the dissent is basically under a lot of pressure, and you do not have a lot of free and fair information surrounding in the country, the public opinion is basically shaped by the government media or the government-controlled discourse as well. But in a period of social media a lot of different sources of information you may have, and the opposition or
even fake.
Yes, or maybe that too. Yeah, misinformation is also important, but different sources of information can find channels, and it's not easy to really shape the public opinion through this, like controlling information or controlling media. So there are two sides to that, but the governments definitely have a lot at their hands, specifically in authoritarian settings, to shape the public opinion. And in terms of the Western question, Senem is going to be commenting on that as well, I guess. But one important thing in the Turkish politics, I think whenever Turkey adopts a certain law, anti-terror law, anti-alcohol consumption law, something like that, they always refer to Western standards and Western laws. They handpick certain, this is like a Hungarian law or UK law, stop and search tactic or asset freeze or this and that. Maybe, it's just one component of that country's law, which is anti-democratic, but it's in there. And then countries like Turkey picks all those pieces of law, brings them together, and then goes to public and says that this is the Western standard. Western countries are basically doing the same thing as we're doing, and they are actually doing that. But the whole pack is like handpicked from each other country, which is like authoritarian. But this also adds up to this idea that we don't have to catch up with the West anymore because we are already applying the Western standards and they have the same standard that they're applying in their own national context. So this decay of the West in terms of its democracy or institutions, the discourse goes, is an important component in the current de-democratization, really, losing the core of democracy.
Senem?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'll take from there. I'll move from the West onto Western question. And your point about being anti-systemic and being anti-Western, I think the two are very closely related. That is to the extent that the West, the post-Second World War order is seen as a Western-dominated order in the way in which the institutions are shaped, in the way in which certain countries have a voice or do not have a voice, etc. And in that sense, the anti-systemic critique is, in that sense, an anti-Western critique in many ways. And let me give you an example of that. When you look at, for instance, we didn't talk about the way in which anti-Westernism is also promoted at the top by the president himself for many years. And when you actually look into his anti-Western discourse, you would see that it's very closely enmeshed with a critique of Western institutions and the so-called Western-dominated order. So he wants to situate Turkey, or he says that he wants to situate Turkey as a more unique country that defies that order, that defies the excesses of that order and reaches out to countries, in Africa, here, there, elsewhere, who are unrepresented or are misrepresented or who don't have a voice in the system. That's why, for instance, he talks about reforming the United Nations Security Council, and he's been going on about it for years, right? So the anti-Western critique is very closely related to the anti-systemic critique. I think this has to be said. Secondly, about foreign policy and public opinion, I agree with Evren. And I think, again, if you want to look at a case, you can, pick up the case of Turkey's attitudes towards Europe, which you mentioned, right? I mean, at the beginning, let's say in 2004, 5, etc., those days when Turkish-EU relations were better, to say, couldn't find a better term. At the time, you saw that Erdogan's constituency was very much in favor of Turkey joining Europe. And if you looked at any public opinion poll, they had all these pro-European views. And then, fast forward to 2016, 17, 18, 19, you have the adverse picture, right? Here we have the opposition seeming to be much more favorable views towards Europe, and you have government constituencies turning super anti-European and anti-Western. So especially in the Turkish case, I don't know about other countries, but particularly in the Turkish case, there is a very strong dynamic between the elite leader discourse and how the public actually responds to it. I wouldn't say that this is the case for every political party. I would say that this relationship is probably weaker in the main opposition than it is in the government party, but in the government party, we have seen how that happens. And the fact that, of course, they control or the means to information is an important point there. And a third point that I want to make in relation to what you brought up, and I just took it among my notes, and I think this is important, because you said that, if the opposition wins, things might pick up with Europe, or it might be... Well, of course, if you look at public opinion polls, you do see that despite all the adversity that seems to characterize the current Turkish-EU relationship or the Turkish-Greek relationship, whatever, you see that a significant part of the Turkish public still wants to have good relations with Europe. They still see the EU as a better partner than the United States or NATO even. And this seems to be much more pronounced among the youth. Right? And this is an important point because, as you know, Turkey is a very young society. The youth takes up a very large percentage of the demography. And plus, the youth seems to harbor much more I would say, concerned attitudes regarding issues like climate change, for instance. They seem to be much more favorable for the Green Deal, the European climate agenda, etc. Now, this is all important, right? And perhaps these give, one some hope for picking up the relationships or the pieces of the relationship. But having said that, I think we also have to keep in mind that there are also other policy areas which lead to an increased politicization of Europe and EU in the public sphere, and that might not bode so well for the relations. And here I'm referring in particular to the migration issue. Migration issue is becoming more and more politicized in Turkey today. And Europe, that somehow was detached from that discussion because the discussion wasn't so politicized, so Europe wasn't so much in the picture, is becoming more and more debated and discussed and politicized because they are seen as the culprits of the current situation due to the EU-Turkey migration deal. And I don't think the opposition can back on that. So in that sense, there will be constraints on the opposition in the future if political constellations change in Turkey. So we'll have to have a balanced view of what we can expect from an opposition-governed country. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Vangeli?
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. It's, I should have mentioned it. So, first of all, when we talk about exceptionalism, the definition is that we belong somewhere, but we are exceptional. Uniqueness is that we don't belong, we are unique. All right. So, when we talk about exceptionalism, this is not absolutely translated into politics, like we see in the Greek case, because it's an exception. It leaves space. When we talk about uniqueness, it translates to politics, as we see the practical politics in Turkey. At the same time, when we are in the exceptionalist position, we are more introverts because we belong somewhere. Right? We are safe. So, politically speaking, the translation of this exceptionalism is to stay where we are. When we are unique, well, we are extrovert. We go, we move, we go to Africa, we go here, we go there. I'm talking about Turkey. And when it comes to identities, and this is important to mention because especially in Turkey, we have this big polarization. We know about it. In the exceptionalism case, in the exceptionalism mindset, we still have space. So who is the good Greek, the bad Greek, whatever, it's much more in a gray zone, right? But when we are in the unique Turkey mindset, then we have the real Turk or the fake Turk or whatever. And this is part of the ongoing polarization. I hope I replied. Thank you.
If I can follow up, and then we can conclude, exactly because we're running out of time, on this question, on exceptionalism. I think what's interesting to see is that the Greeks, on the one hand, they feel that they're European, but they also feel threatened by Western values. So, in a sense, there is a claim that we co-define the West. So we're part of the West and we constitute it to some degree. Well, Turks never feel like that. They feel that the West is an external influence. It's good or bad, but it's something that they have to manage and discuss within their within political parties or civil society movements. On the specific question on the point I made about the distribution of support to Russia towards the extremes of the political spectrum, even in the case where 52% support that Russia should be part of the European family, you'll see there's 70%. So it is this distribution remains valid. And on the question on Western, whether the West is Western, we can identify the West as a community of values, as an alliance, practically, right? So it is, the West is an alliance today. You can argue that, many argue in the West that like Russia has been manipulating, has been using liberalism and like liberal naivete to some degree in order to promote its interests there. So they may have to make some tactical sacrifices to the standard of human rights and freedom of press and expression. And of course there, the question is whether we trust the institutions, because institutions are supposed to make sure that this is not going to go beyond a certain point. But I see your point, and then of course, it also reflects on this anti-systemic attitude that is very much present there. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for being with us. I would like to thank our speakers.
No.
Yes.
I would like to debate a little bit more with Senem. Am I right?
We don't have time. We have to conclude it maybe later.
We can do it over lunch.
Yes, exactly. So thank you very much. In the second panel, we've been discussing the regional implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We have a number of distinguished speakers with us. We have 5 of them physically present, and one, Dr. Ian Lesser, who's been joining us via an electronic connection, via Zoom. I will be reading the names of the speakers. First will be Ahmet Evin, professor and senior scholar in the Istanbul Policy Center, professor at Sabancı University. Then we will listen to Shaban Kardash, who is a professor of international relations at Top University of Economics and Technology in Ankara. Then Alkis Kurkulas, who has been for many, many years correspondent and head of the Athens News Agency in Istanbul. Then Dr. Elena Nazarou, who is a research fellow at ELIAMEP at the head of the External Policy Unit at the European Parliamentary Research Service. Then we'll have Dr. Ian Lesser, Vice President Executive Director, the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Brussels. Then Dr. Habibe Özdal, Assistant Professor of International Relations from Istanbul Okan University. We've agreed to divide the labor among ourselves. So Professor Evin will speak first, and his presentation will focus on the implications of the war on the energy geopolitics of the region and the energy market. So Ahmet, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be in Athens, and it's good to be back after the pandemic, where one had very limited mobility. I will just go through very fast these few visuals here. See the EU 27 annual domestic production. What happens here is that it has been going up, and then all of a sudden, of course, with the pandemic, the demand and the consumption has come down. But 2021, it has not gone up any further than 2020. That is a bit of a problem in terms of the amount of gas available was not keeping up with the demand. And with the war in Ukraine, Russia's attack on Ukraine, all of a sudden, the alternative to Russian gas became a critical question. And here are alternatives, and from which of these sources EU could get additional gas in order to meet the demand. As you might recall from yesterday's Financial Times, for example, Germany has lifted restrictions on coal and has recommissioned coal-fired plants because all of a sudden, 2 days before that, from the Nord Stream 1, the amount of gas being pumped to Germany was reduced by 60%. So there is a very sudden and also quite a challenge to meet the immediate demand to keep the economy going, and not only that, but keep the refrigerators at home working and your light at home working, and so on. So this is one thing that is interesting, that prior to the Russian invasion, the amount of LNG brought to Europe was increasing substantially, so that is one source that one is focusing on. The other one that is has been important in terms of Greek, Turkish, and East Med relations is the what do you do with East Med gas? As you see, the estimated capacity in East Med gas is very, very limited. The largest deposit there is the Egyptian Zohr field. Rest of it is very small. So over the years, I have maintained, and it was not a popular viewpoint, that there isn't enough gas there to really warrant the investment for East Med gas pipeline. Now, this business of the challenge right now has changed things, because Europe is looking for replacement, literally liter by liter. What can we get from whom immediately? And that changes the question a little bit, that the East Med delimitation, friction, ability to build or not build, finance or not finance this East Med gas is no longer the question, but the temporary solution is to get LNG from the existing plants, as you see there, from Egypt, Damietta, and Itku. This is what happened, just one of the many graphs. You see that the shooting up of natural gas prices. And you see that there are two very large, very conspicuous peaks, and one is before the Ukrainian war, and the other one is following the beginning of the hostilities. Now, what this means actually is that two price hikes came one after the other. It's like sometimes if you're sailing and all of a sudden two waves just come on top of one another, and you have a hard time keeping the boat straight. This is exactly what happened, because the demand, the increase in demand in the last quarter of 21 was unanticipatedly high. So there's already a shortage of energy, and then came the war, so the anticipation of that, and you can see that the price is phenomenally high. It went up 10 times the price, and of course there is an implication also of this in term to the major economies, because Western economies, German, France, and so on, have basically put subvention support to the prices, and that then has it has two consequences. One is that the subvention state expenditures are increasing, and at the same time, there is inflation, and that has an effect on inflation. So there's tight money policies coming, and tight money policies will then make the deficit worse because money will be more expensive. Now, that is by way of introduction. As I said, 21, faster than expected recovery has had a consequence, followed by the Russian invasion. Both of them led to higher prices. Will there be change in habits? One of the factors that are anticipated in a number of policy reports, including the Commission's own report, that with the prices going up, there will be change in habits, and this whole thing is going to support the green transition, energy transition. Will this accelerate the energy transition? Well, in a way, yes, but I put a question mark there because, as I mentioned, the response to inflation is tight money policies, and energy transition will need capital investments, and with tight money policies, amount of money available, in fact, to spur that transition. So, as usual with energy, anything with energy, you have a Janus type of two faces looking in opposite directions, and this is not an exception. There is a possible threat of stagflation, and that would be the case, a serious case, if, in fact, for example, Germany were to start rationing gas to industry. That will have a major challenge to keep the German economy on target. Now, there are these reports about how to wean the EU from its dependence on Russian gas. The reports that I have read, and will share my own assessment, is that EU reports on this have been, shall I say, reflect a bit of Candidesque optimism. I think the situation is a little more serious than what the earlier report says. This was a very summary, two-line summary of what the Commission said in March. We already committed ourselves to emission cut by 55%, but under these circumstances, is that achievable when you are actually going back to burning coal? But this target is consistent with 30% reduction in gas consumption by 2030, by 100 BCM. Well, the original idea was that you could do this by 2030 by investing money in transition, and then, in the best of all possible worlds, China would come in and start building this Pride of Siberia 2 from Yamal across the eastern Siberian plain via Mongolia to China. So Russia's dependency on the European consumer would wean itself, and then China would be sending its gas to, Russia would be sending its gas to China, major geopolitical change, the whole thing. And then the EU would actually move for greener fuels, essentially electrifying, and then possibly investing considerable amount in hydrogen. Now, what we are seeing, however, that this is very difficult, very simple calculation here. We expect 43 BCM more gas in 22 available. But that gas is available from already existing sources because these were not producing as much when the demand for the year before. So there is not, if you add these figures that I put there, additional pipeline, maximum 15 BCM, and then on the demand side, if people change their habits and start turning off lights, another 14 BCM. If you add these 30, maximum 72, 73. So there is that gap remaining there. In the medium term, I think my time is running out. In the medium term, there may be other sources. But the crisis and the challenge of this crisis is not going to be resolved before the medium term. So what we're facing, two things. We have a considerable energy crisis because of this, a price crisis because of this, and economic implications of this that are too early to analyze, but it's not, the economic implications are not going to be easy. And the only relation with the closer region, for example, Eastern Mediterranean and so on, if anything, marginally, there is good news that there is not going to be a problem of delimitation because the small amounts can be carried from the Egyptian sources. What the Egyptians will do is something else because they also need that gas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. The floor goes now to Professor Kardas, and he is going to discuss strategic implications of the war, and in particular the question of strategic autonomy as has been raised in recent discussions in Turkey and beyond.
Thank you, Ioannis. Thank you for this invitation to both institutions. I mean, Ioannis asked me about this concept of strategic autonomy, but it came up also in the first session in terms of how it was also a very prevalent idea among the publics, but my intention was to talk about the strategic autonomy, the concept of strategic autonomy from a rather state level. And it reminded me a discussion we had at GMF on Turkey publications more than 10 years ago. Yun Soli Özel, they wrote a couple of pieces for the GMF trying to understand the new strategic orientation of Turkey. And it was, I guess, in 2011 that I wrote a piece to continue conversation in which I was trying to argue that the concept of strategic autonomy is what drives Turkey's international orientation. In recent years, again, we see a reference to this concept, but in my understanding, sometimes trying to discuss this concept more in a domestic setting, trying to focus on the domestic dimensions of the use of strategic autonomy is misleading because the way I at least personally look at this concept is more from a kind of systemic level, state level analysis, in the sense that this drive or desire or quest for strategic autonomy has been one of the properties of Turkey's international conduct. In that sense, the discussion earlier we had uniqueness or exceptionalism, to me, do not make much sense because for countries in Turkey's position, it's a kind of structural property in the sense that the systemic conditions pressure countries in such positions to pursue strategic autonomy as part of their international orientation. But of course, it doesn't mean that there is no domestic dimension. There is no individual level impact here, especially the ideology, identity of Turkey's ruling elite in the last 2 decades. It does also play a role in putting strategic autonomy at the very center of Turkey's foreign policy. But let's keep in mind that it has been there even before the AK Party came to power. And then you see different interpretations of how to assert Turkey's strategic autonomy at the regional level, at the international level, even before that. But during the AK Party time, especially considering Davutoğlu's approach to international relations, there was indeed a civilizational emphasis on that. It was blended by realpolitik and geopolitics in that sense, geoculture together, more of the normative dimension. But it doesn't negate the fact that it is there. It has been there. It is beyond AK Party's own core political orientation. So in practical terms, moving beyond this theoretical approach to this concept, what does it mean? Basically, it means that in most cases, Turkey filters its foreign policy options through this concept. And then in that respect, Ioannis asked us to talk about, of course, the implications of Russia-Ukraine conflict war, and then what it means for the way forward. I mean, the way personally I have always looked at Turkish foreign policy, Turkey is situated at the intersection of regional subsystems and the international system, and this is the same for when it comes to Turkey in the Black Sea context, Turkey in the Middle East context, and Turkey in the East or Mediterranean context. And then in that particular positioning, the key question in many cases that shapes Turkey's foreign policy orientation and choices is this question of where does the threat come from? What is the main source of threat to Turkey's main vital interest? So to put it simply, does the threat come from the region or from the extra-regional international players, mainly the penetration of the West in Turkey's own neighborhood? In most cases, practically it is the penetration of the United States in the particular region in which Turkey is trying to exert its influence. Yes, I also in that respect agree with the discussions in the first session that Turkey's actorness, Westernness in terms of geopolitical orientation is a dubious concept. It is not just a member of the Western strategic security community without any questioning. It's not an unconditional membership. In a sense, it is also filtered through this strategic autonomy, the extent to which membership into the Western security community enhances, expands Turkey's room of maneuver at the regional level. This is, I guess, a better way to understand Turkey's relationship with the West. And the question is, membership into the West, does it expand my regional options or constrain them? This is a very practical solution. And when we look at different cases in the past, the Iraq war, the way Turkey responded, 2008 Russia-Georgia war, and all these discussions about the Russian revisionism in the last almost 2 decades again, different phases, at least 15 years. Turkey, I sense that has always filtered through this question. What is the main source of challenge to my interest? Is it the Russian revisionism or is it the American response to Russian revisionism? So this is a simple equation. And I think because of that, because of this kind of balancing between the implications of regional threats, whether it is Iran, depending on the situation, whether it was Daesh in the Middle East, when we look at what happened in the wake of the Arab Spring, versus the American reaction to this regional challenge or American designs in the region, this has been always shaping Turkey's calculations. There is definitely a domestic element here. I am not disregarding it, but I just want to note it. The individual level analysis is important. The leadership style, the personal approach, to some extent personalized foreign policy practices in recent years. They all play a role. But here, let me remind again, I am trying to draw attention to the strategic context. So what happened? Personally, I wrote one chapter of my dissertation on 2008 Russia-Georgia war and the Turkish policies, and since then, the way I see it, we are under-responding to the Russian aggression. Not only Turkey, but the entire Western community has been under-responding. It is accommodating, and we can even call it, we have been appeasing Russia, and in different ways, and this is the big puzzle or discussion now, why we ended up in that particular situation where we are at with Russia question. Ahmet Hocam shared all these projections. I remember at ISA when you were a fellow at GMF in Washington, and at ISA more than 10 years ago, we were discussing the same questions, and the reliance on the Russian gas, how to cut down on it, inability to cut down. More than 10 years down the way, we are still sharing the same projections. There is no hope in the short term, maybe in the mid-term, and then we will see what happens 2 years down the way. So this is the big challenge, and in that, I think Turkey also went along with the wave to some extent, but there were unique factors that also played a role in Turkey's own accommodation with Russia. This is where I think we need to put emphasis on a couple of factors where I will briefly try to conclude my part. First, this special relationship with Russia, which has been building up. There are individual interests, economic interests, strategic interests to some extent. And it was because of the own course of Turkish-Russian relationship in which from the perspective of both parties, developing a kind of compartmentalized relationship to manage their living together in their own neighborhood, played a role in the eventual Turkish accommodation of Russia. The second dimension, which is also important, is related to kind of a strategic ambiguity. This concept is also important, I guess, in the sense that what was the eventual Russian objective in this neo-revisionism? What did Russia really want? There was a question mark around that question, and this is actually the ambivalent responses when you look at the Turkish or Greek public opinions, but it is the same for international relations scholars. Maybe you have noticed John Mearsheimer, his presentations, Russian foreign minister sharing John Mearsheimer's lectures, because there was ambiguity, and Turkey interpreted that ambiguity in a way that Russia, at the end of the day, was not a kind of aggressive expansionist power, that it threatens Turkey's vital interests, but you can sort of develop your own accommodated relationship with Russia. And Turkey, instead of taking the pessimistic view, prefer to take the optimistic view about this ambivalent Russian intentions. But there were also, I would say, of course, domestic factors which led to a certain co-optation, maybe Russian influence, economic interest to some extent also on the media. Turkish, you referred to how Russia has been influential in shaping the public opinion here. In Turkey, maybe it is not as big, but still, at least to some extent, you may see the impact to some extent on the part of media as well. But there is a new reality now, and this is the new reality, strategic challenge, not only for Turkey, but for the entire European or Western security community. In my understanding, the big challenge here is how to live with this new Russia, revisionist Russia. You cannot avoid it. You cannot look the other way around. You cannot say that its intentions are justified because we pushed with NATO enlargement too far, maybe. So there are no excuses. Now everybody has to live with this reality. From a Turkish point of view, this is, I think, a big strategic challenge. Now, this is a new strategic adjustment. There is an unfolding debate, but that debate is not really happening that openly. We will see implications perhaps later. And then for Turkey, Maybe you have noticed some statements by Mr. Çavuşoğlu from time to time, the defense minister himself, about the attitude of certain NATO allies in terms of how to counter Russia. There I sense that the big concern is from a Turkish point of view, from at least the governmental point of view, if the counter-Russian moves take a very extreme direction, the externalities, the security implications, the threats that it may create for Turkey, this is what shapes the thinking. So the response to Russia should be geared in a way to limit further instability in Turkey's shared neighborhood with Russia, not only in the Black Sea, Caucasus context, and especially if you remember the recent orientation toward Central Asia, a new initiative. I guess this shapes the thinking to a great extent. In that respect, I see again the classical concepts we use to define Turkish strategic culture, cautiousness versus daring. So again, the cautiousness is prevailing, going along the lone wolf concept, syndrome, according to some, it is also there. But in many ways, the uniqueness or exceptionalism are quite explainable from a structural point of view. Ioannis is telling me to stop.
Yes, we have to manage our time so that we finish the event in time. Thank you very much, Shaban, for your very important comments. So now the floor goes to Alkis Kourkoulas, who's going to speak about the role of the media and the war in Greece and Turkey and beyond.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much, Ioannis. I'm confident to state that nothing has changed very much in this environment. So I'm, despite my, the absence from the field, I mean, in a couple of years now, I can see that the structures are the same, so, and the behavior is the same, and I presume that the media are influencing in the same way the decision-making process, and especially in the Greek-Turkish environment. I'm basing this assumption on the fact that despite the radical changes in the ownership and in the media market, both in Greece and in Turkey, the basic structures are remaining the same. In the Turkish market, there is a system of centralized ownership that was always there. The nature of this censorship, I mean, the owners have changed, but the structure is still there. And again, there is the authority of the official message that it's very easy to diffuse, I mean, and to spread. The same goes for the Greek market, despite the spectacular changes, the economic crisis, the changes of the. We have almost the same kind of structure. Big corporations that are very much linked to the state and the government are controlling the media. But again, the difficulty of diffusing the official message, it's still the same. There's a kind of disbelief and a kind of rejection of the or whatever it comes from the above. The only thing that has changed, I think, is the Russian angle. But again, I mean, with the crisis, with the Ukrainian crisis. But again, this is it's only a very superficial change, because the Russian angle has been always there, despite the discretion with which we were dealing with it. I mean, all along the very complex Greek-Turkish conflict, and especially when it comes to the Cyprus, it was always there. I mean, Cyprus was always a very easy way to interfere in the in a NATO environment. I mean, and it was always exploited by the Russians in a very discreet way. I have to refer to a new research that was recently published that puts that in perspective in a very, very spectacular way. I'm speaking about a book that was published by the Makarios Drusiotis in Nicosia by the end of last year, and it's still very difficult to find it in the Greek market. The only thing that has changed, and I must say that not as a compliment, is that the efforts that have been deployed, I mean, for many, many years, have come to a concrete outcome. This initiative is, I think, it's very, very important, and I'm not saying that as a compliment. 25 years ago, we have tried after the EMEA crisis and in the context of a group of Greek-Turkish journalists that tried to create a kind of a cooperation, I mean, to institutionalize such a forum and produce every 6 months or every year, I mean, an opinion poll that will sort of highlight the thing. The thing never happened. At that time, we haven't the assistance of the think tanks, which was extremely. It proves now it's extremely important. But because I'm familiar with that, I'm confident that your effort is going to be extremely useful. It's a tool that will help journalists, politicians, and will create the environment of personal exchange. I mean, in so in that respect. In that respect, another change that I have to underline, I try to sort of refer to that with a question I have put yesterday, is that I have the feeling that there is a basic change in the way we were defining the perceptions of the problems. I mean, I'm not speaking about how the defense or the diplomacy was the traditional Greek-Turkish problems were seated in the Aegean, and they had a very complex legal and other argumentation that was leading to one argument to the other. But since a decade now, or less than a decade, we have added to that the Eastern Mediterranean problem, which is not just the East Med. It's the economic zones and the claim that one of the small Dodecanese islands can control the whole area there, which, in my view, it's automatically perceived in Turkey as an aberration, as a claim that cannot stand. I mean, and so puts out all the rest of the. I mean, and makes it difficult to make a rational discussion or a rational, and somehow affects the ability of the communities. I mean, to perceive and understand what's going on. So once we come over that, I think that there's not much less to add to that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your contribution. I'll now give the floor to Dr. Elena Lazaru, who is going to talk about the European angle of our discussion.
Thank you, Ioannis. Good, morning or almost afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be home in the Eastern Mediterranean Aegean space to talk about these issues and to see friends in Athens and elsewhere. Indeed, what I would like to talk about, and I'll try to be brief in the interest of time, is how does the European response to Russia's war on Ukraine hold perhaps potential for the region to move towards new directions, to enhance existing areas of potential cooperation, and how perhaps it will aggravate issues. And I'll leave a lot of these conclusions to the audience, and what I'd like to focus on is what does this response entail and then perhaps a couple of comments on that. So, obviously, the EU has been operating since 2019 under what is called a geopolitical commission, but nothing is more geopolitical as a war on the east of Europe. Nothing forces considerations that are as geopolitical as an armed conflict and challenge to international law. And I think the first thing one can say about the response of the EU to this war is that there is a normative shift, which is incorporated in what is referred in the Brussels jargon as the Versailles Agenda. But essentially, it's a decision by the leaders to move towards not strategic autonomy, but I would say strategic sovereignty in 3 areas at least. And these 3 areas are energy, defense, and the economy. Now, this translates into, as we have heard, a strong reflection and a plan, the Repower EU plan and others, on how to make the EU more energy sufficient, self-sufficient, in the long, but also in the short term, given the urgency of this crisis. As you know, a plan has been presented, but the plan, apart from many other things, which includes boosting the EU's own energy production, I think more interestingly for this conversation, is proposing potential common purchases, a platform for liaising with partners in that area. We've seen some activism on behalf of the Commission President von der Leyen in visiting countries with that potential, including most recently Egypt. So I think that is a first dimension on which we can discuss about this energy angle, which definitely is something that the region definitely comes into the conversation. And Israel's been mentioned, Egypt's been mentioned, obviously the Turkmen republics have been mentioned, and of course, when one looks at the map, that goes through Turkey too. Secondly, economic. And of course, the economic angle of of sovereignty, of strategic sovereignty or resilience even, is something that's not new. Last year, everyone who's following EU politics was focused on the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the response to the coronavirus pandemic. But with this crisis adding itself on that, the emphasis on implementing that in the correct way, in the way that will be effective, efficient, create resilience, resilience which, by the way, also goes to areas such as supply chains and the industry, that has become even more urgent. And again, when we talk about industry and supply chains, obviously geography matters, the region matters. Where can the supply chain disruption that has been caused by the war be made up for, looking at other potential infrastructure, existing or potential infrastructure for transport? That's an angle that comes into that conversation. Again, something with the regional dimension. And then the third aspect of this Versailles agenda is the defense dimension, and I'll go into that in a couple of minutes, but obviously, again, relevant for this conversation, given that we're looking at a region where we have Turkey, a NATO member, Greece, the highest GDP, percentage of GDP spender in NATO, and a lot of security and defense issues going on. Beyond the Versailles agenda, just to put the other issues just on the table, because we're going to have a conversation after this, a couple of other points of the EU's response where I think partnership more broadly and more specifically with those neighboring countries, like this region, are important. Coordination on sanctions across what was called by Ahmed, I think, the Western security community. In many ways, sanctions have been the #1 response to this war. But of course, sanctions are as effective as your partnerships. And to have those partners on board, that also includes partners in the neighborhood of this region. Secondly, on these extra issues beyond Versailles, the future of the EU's enlargement and neighborhood policy. And again, here, the war has precipitated a reaction, which on the one hand has been to consider as candidates countries that are perhaps were not previously going to be considered as candidates that soon. But secondly, a discussion on European political community, Macron's proposal, the European geopolitical community, Charles Michel's proposal. That's a new engagement with those members of this perhaps Western security community. I like that Ahmed said that, with NATO allies that are non-EU. And that, of course, again, is Turkey. So why including others, of course. So that's also something I think we should think about when we think of in the region. I want to hone in a bit on the defense dimension because Ioannis asked me to, but also because I think it's quite relevant and quite unprecedented what we've seen in response to the war in Ukraine. Just briefly to go over what we've seen the activation of a mechanism, the European Peace Facility, which supports the provision of lethal equipment to Ukraine through financing member states for that provision. We've seen enhanced EU-NATO cooperation. I think more than ever before, we're looking at a NATO summit and a potential third EU-NATO declaration where that is very pronounced. We've seen a reconsideration of the EU CSDP missions to include very diverse angles, but really to bring in partners which can help with the implementation of international law, for example, when it comes to war crimes. We've seen discussions about solidarity in defense, both within the EU, Article 42.7 of the EU, but also I would call it an enhanced solidarity, or rather a double solidarity with EU members that are not NATO members now applying to become part of NATO, Finland and Sweden more notably. And that whole idea of solidarity that through both the EU and NATO begs a very big solution in this part of the world. Because really, if you are in Brussels right now discussing this, and even in Washington, this issue of Turkey being in NATO, Cyprus being in the EU, and NATO, this triangle here is a big issue that comes up in that discussion. So really, we're seeing a reaction to the war on Ukraine, which is EU-NATO closer cooperation, and this is the focal region that many see as the place to solve this. So I think this is a big issue. At the same time, still on defense, I think it's important to note that not just the NATO-EU relation has been strengthened through this crisis, but we're seeing a move towards more transatlantic coordination on security and defense on the EU-US level, through the security and defense dialogue, through what I think will be a process that will lead to defense industrial standards between the EU and the US, through the Trade and Technology Council, but other discussions that are also taking place. And there again, it's important to think about this region, because this region and its defense procurement, including the well-known issues that all of you, I'm sure, know of Turkish defense procurement arrangements, that also comes into play. That is also, I think, something that if we're looking forward to the potential that the EU's reaction to this war offers for this region is something that should be thought about and moved forward. So I've finished my time, so I think I should stop here. But perhaps to say, just to end, I started with geopolitics, and the geopolitics are shifting, and they're shifting. Even though François Bourg said a few days ago, and I thought that was a great thing to say, we think that the geopolitics are shifting to the northeast of Europe, but the geopolitics are also shifting to the southeast of Europe. We have the Black Sea in focus. We have the OSCE, when you look at it, it's not that north, it's more extended east. We have a potential for triggers of conflict that will surround the EU's neighborhood in the Mediterranean. So I think it's very important to have this conversation today. I think it's very important that in this southeastern region of the EU, what is holding back greater potential for partnership and cooperation is addressed in ways that go beyond weaponizations of discourse and narratives that sometimes appear in various types of media, as has been said, because this crisis and this geopolitical shift is very real in this region, but also the potential to face it is also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena, for your contribution. I'll now give the floor to Ian, who's connecting from Brussels, and he's going to talk about the American dimension and the American views of all these developments in our region.
Okay. Ioannis, thank you very, very much. And my apologies for not being there in person. I would have liked that very much, but it wasn't possible this week. And thank you very much for allowing me to participate this way. A lot has been said already, and I'll be quite brief. Let me maybe just make 3 points to you about how the United States is seeing, in particular, not so much the war in Ukraine as a whole, because that's heavily discussed, but how we're seeing the role of Turkey in this, and also Greece. And the developments in the region. The first point I'd make is that, and this has already come out from some of the discussion, what Shaban has said and others, Turkey is a full stakeholder in this conflict. in many, many respects, economically, in security terms, in terms of alliance relations, in terms of the equation in the Black Sea per se, and also potentially part of a number of solutions to some of the problems that we're seeing at the moment, very grave challenges around food security and other things. And we've heard a little bit already about the sort of delicate balance that Turkey has been trying to play between Russia, where it has a lot of established relations and very broad-based ones, and also a relationship with Ukraine and also with its Western partners. And that's not an easy line to tread, it seems to me. I would say that when it comes to the relationship with the United States, there's no question that the war in Ukraine, and this is true for Europe as well, has underscored kind of the geopolitical importance of Turkey as a partner, given where it is in relation to the conflict. But it's really done nothing to solve any of the very troubled issues that are plaguing the relationship with Washington and also, of course, with Brussels. Let me talk about Washington for a moment. I think we know there's a long list of bilateral problems between Turkey and the United States. Ukraine conflict has frankly done nothing to solve any of them. And in fact, it's even added a couple. There is a view, of course, that Turkey would like to see, and you hear this in Ankara, that Turkey would like to see its sort of visible importance in relation to the geopolitics of the conflict to help sort of break the logjam on a number of other things. But the truth is, given the atmosphere in Washington at the moment, which is really uniformly negative, I would say, across the aisle, both Republicans and Democrats, about Turkey, and this is the result of years of accumulated grievances, frankly, on both sides, that there's just very little prospect of movement here between S-400s and a whole set of other things. But just to take that one for a second, this was already a kind of principal complaint that the United States has had with Turkey. Part of it has been about Russia, of course, and the fact that it's a Russian system that Turkey bought. Well, you can imagine, under the current circumstances, that looks even worse, especially on Capitol Hill. And if you add to that the fact that Turkey has been quite explicit in saying that it's not going to impose at least the full spectrum of sanctions that have been agreed across the Atlantic on Russia, this simply fuels the problem. Turkey has some things it's looking for these days, including something like F-16 modernization, new F-16s and modernization kits and other things. The mood in Congress obviously is very negative about this to begin with. It will be even more negative against a backdrop of seeming Turkish unresponsiveness on the sanctions issue. So it's not an easy atmosphere for sure. But set against that is the fact that Turkey really does matter in this. It matters for many different reasons that have already been mentioned. But, just to mention some others, there are many places where things can go wrong with Russia that touch on Turkey directly. In Syria, in Libya, in the Caucasus, in the Eastern Mediterranean, even if there is no deliberate interest in escalation, potential for something simply to go wrong and escalate is absolutely there. And if you think back to the shooting down of Russian aircraft by Turkey some years ago, in 2015, 2016, imagine that today. And imagine the attitude inside NATO today. It's debatable. So this is the kind of environment that we're in. The second point I make is that the NATO dimension is also not helpful. We're moving towards a summit in Madrid at the end of the month. As we hear the prospects for Turkey lifting or there being some resolution to this dispute over membership for Finland and Sweden, which Turkey has been very much against until its concerns about its perceived support, for PKK terrorism, but certainly, questions of asylum seekers and a longstanding history of asylum in Sweden in particular for Kurdish dissidents. These things are not going to be easy to resolve on either side for reasons that we can discuss. Can this logjam be broken at the summit, perhaps by President Biden's intervention? Maybe, and maybe that's what President Erdogan is waiting for. but I'm not so sure. And the mood at the moment is a bit pessimistic about this. In any case, the net result of this is to further fuel a very negative attitude towards Turkey at the moment in Washington, but not, of course, just in Washington. A final point, because you asked me to say something about the US and Greece. I mean, you'll all be aware that the relationship between Athens and Washington over the last years has improved immeasurably across multiple administrations on both sides, actually, for many different reasons, which we could discuss. But I frankly don't see this stopping. And in many ways, I could imagine the war in Ukraine and a deteriorating security environment in the Eastern Mediterranean only reinforcing the logic of this close relationship. And here I would, come back to something that Elena mentioned, that there is a tendency to see now the challenges in the East as the center of gravity, and that's true in many respects. But, there really, frankly, is more of a nexus between East and South than there is simply a kind of sharp firewall between these concerns. They do relate to one another. And as the security environment has become more challenging, it seems to me that, again, the logic for this Greek-Turkish relationship, Greek-US relationship becomes even stronger. So let me maybe just end with that, but look forward to our discussion.
Özal, who is an expert on Russian-Turkish relations, so she will give us some insights on how this relationship has morphed over the last couple of weeks since the war began.
Thank you so much, Ioannis, for the invitation and actually for organizing this very interesting panel. I'll be very brief due to this time restrictions. So if I go very brief on some specific issues, please raise your questions later on so we can go in detail. I will argue two things. The one is that Turkey-Russia relations, the character of Turkey-Russia relations are changing because we're talking about more than 20 years, like almost 20 years long period. So there are specific changing characteristics by the time, and therefore I'm going to mention several turning points. And finally, I'll come to the war and how it changes relations, or what does that mean for Turkey. At the beginning of 2000s, that was definitely for Turkey and for Russia, that was definitely a part of multidimensionalism. All right, let's bear that in mind. Relations with Russia has been one of the main columns, but not the only one. The EU harmonization law were already adopted by Turkey. Relations with US were quite good, etc. It was for the first time in 2006, we have heard the axis of excluded discussion, whether Russia and Turkey were excluded from the Western world, so whether they would come together and represent some alternative, etc. At the beginning of 2000s, let me remind you that Turkey was one of the biggest economies, like 16th or 17th economy in the world. So that definitely was one common ground that Turkey and Russia at that time shared, growing economies, BRICS, MICTA. So this was sort of a challenge to a world, the system of Western world. So Sanemoji actually mentioned, anti-Westernism sometimes is an anti-systemic raise of voice. The world is bigger than five. Definitely was President Erdogan's, a criticism to this very strict Western world order, and Turkey, according to President Erdogan, had to say more in line with its economic power, etc. But as I have mentioned, that was when Turkish economy was really booming at that time. So multipolar world order, BRICS, MICTA, this anti-Westernism was so much in line with anti-systemic stance. 2011 definitely is one of the turning points regarding to changing characteristics. Justice and Development Party started to gain much more self-confidence at domestic level. Liberals were much more left out of the system in terms of domestic politics. And the shift has started to be a bit more clear. The Arab Spring exactly started in the same period. Since then, we will see deteriorating relations with West. And the more relations deteriorated, the more Turkey became closer to Russia, even though, and this is still the case, we don't talk about common vision, common perception, common regional perspectives, etc. 2015, the coup attempt, on the one hand, this is the warplane incident, which is the end of compartmentalization in terms of Turkey-Russia relations. But also later, the coup attempt in Turkey definitely has changed the characteristics. Since then, we do see much more domestic elements shaping Turkish foreign policy making. The alliance with the US has changed. A partnership with Russia do continue. This is very important. The wording I'm choosing specifically because, the PYD support of the United States is not acceptable as an ally, but PYD support of Russia is okay because it's a partner. So the partnership is a huge flexibility. So therefore, the main criticism in terms of public opinion, etc., there is a huge Russian impact in Turkey, which shapes the perspective of Turks towards Russia. There has been a huge optimism through the first decade of 2000s. Turkey called Russia, the mainstream media, let me say, strategic partner, even though Russia never called Turkey as a strategic partner. So this is why I call it optimism. The limits were much more clear looking from the Russian perspective. In 2015, after the warplane incident with the normalization, I don't call it normalization, and I'm not going to call it normalization until I go to Russia without a visa. I do need a visa. Prior to the warplane incident, we had a visa-free regime started by 2011. So normalization, but not that much normalization. Since then, a relationship is being called as rivalry and cooperation. Some say marriage of convenience. This is to say that not shared threat perception, not shared global vision, but a need to work together. So this is the main dynamic of Turkey-Russia relations. We have to understand that Eurasianism is a stream that sometimes has a huge impact in Turkish foreign policy making, not always, but sometimes. This Eurasianist ideology underestimates the differences, but differences do exist. So there are certain limits. We have seen those limits throughout 2000s. They do still exist. So the war in Ukraine has started when Turkey was in this new dynamics in terms of managing relations with Russia. The main policy was balancing approach. That was a necessity. Turkey had no other option than balanced approach. Right after 2014, Turkey-Ukraine relations started to grow. The annexation of Crimea is a turning point here. Ukraine started to invest more on its military capacity, and Turkey started to provide Bayraktars. Turkey and Ukraine finally had a Black Sea region, or let me say, started to see Russia dominating the Black Sea, so the other coastal states also needed to cooperate in order to balance a bit more Russian existence there. But relations with Russia also continued to develop more. So the balanced approach was a need. Here, Turkey also wanted to use its mediating role because it had such a good relations with both parties, and person-to-person relations between President Erdogan and President Putin allowed Turkey to host 2 meetings, one in Ankara, one in Istanbul. None of them, as we know, unfortunately, played a great role so that, to solve the issue. However, even though when it's been discussed, Turkish foreign policy in terms of Ukraine war, many do elaborate economy, saying that Turkish economy is in a huge crisis, so therefore economically Turkey was very fragile and wanted to play a role. Yes, indeed, but please also bear in mind the geopolitics. Turkey-Russia relations are so much the product of Putin-Erdogan investments. None of them would like to lose it. And it's supported, looking from Russian perspective, Turkey, a NATO member but a free rider, that's a great opportunity for President Putin to have in his hands. Looking from Turkey, Russia is an important regional power. No matter who is in charge in Turkey, Russia is an important regional power. So this is why, while thinking about Turkish foreign policy towards the region in terms of Ukraine war, economy, geopolitics, and advantages that Turkey have in terms of this mediating role, that was quite a successful policy at that time, to be honest. But the consequences, let me just mention several areas so that I can finish there. This is going to have not only regional and global consequences as well. In terms of regional sphere, the Black Sea, Turkey used to dominate the Black Sea. This has changed totally with the annexation of Crimea and afterwards. Imagine what if Ukraine loses all its Black Sea coastal areas, then Turkey is going to see this revisionist Russia in a much more powerful way. 100% this is not something in line with Turkish national interests. Now, Turkish foreign policy makers or elites do not raise that much this point, but I believe in case of another warplane incident, I hope we do never see this, but in case of these certain areas, we will have to manage it, and it's going to be too late to challenge or to change already existing situation. The second one is also important, the global dimension of the crisis. Turkey is not only a regional player, but also we do live in the world system as well. You know, the post-Western world order, this is sort of an interim regime. In terms of normative power, what sort of regimes are going to be acceptable, authoritarian, or whatsoever? So whether a violation of rule of law, violation of international law is going to be acceptable. So this is a very rigid question that Ukraine war is going to show us. But also bear in mind, Turkey, Germany, some other states also always mention, can we really isolate Russia from Europe, European security, or how long can Russia be isolated? States like Turkey, Russia, China, or those states who do not necessarily are admitted to be loyal to liberal Western order in terms of norms, they need to be included, and how they are going to be included. This is also important looking from Turkish perspective. I don't know whether I made it on time, but let me finish here so that we may continue. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So we have 15 minutes left for discussion. I suggest we have a round of questions and then we give the speakers the opportunity to respond so that we conclude the event on time. So anybody wishes to raise a question?
It was all crystal clear, huh?
Maybe you would like to? No? Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I mean, because of another meeting, I missed the first two questions, and and my questions is not only about my classes, but I just would like to ask not about the Ukraine and the Russian invasion, but I just would like to ask particularly Shaban from his some of real political experiences as well. Do you think still Turkey has a little bit of capacity to play a kind of a mediator role between these two? Or this was just a play to show Erdogan for himself to the US or to the domestic politics? What do you think about that? Okay. Now I'm taking off my glass and not another question.
Yes, one question behind.
Thank you. I would like to ask Habibe about the prospects of Turkey-Russia relationship in case of changing of government in Turkey.
In case of?
Change of government in Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And two questions here, the front.
I'm coming a little back to what we just discussed in the first session and then what Alkis Kukula said regarding the role of the media. I think the media are very important in creating public opinion. They're part of this whole machinery. And Alkis, you said something which I would like you, if you can expand on that, maybe also the other panelists. You said that the structure, the difficulty of defining the official message of diffusing the official message is still the same. So you are suggesting there's an official message regarding all these issues, and this is so could you expand on this? What is the role of the media messaging and so on in the context also of the Greek-Turkish issues, but maybe also beyond in the Ukrainian situation?
Yes, thank you. I would like to ask whether the benefit of managing crisis in Syria, in Libya, between Turkey and Russia to the exclusion of others has contributed in enhancing this Russian-Turkey synergy, if strategic synergy, I would say that. Thank you.
So thank you very much. So I'd like to turn the floor to the speakers who would like to respond to the questions raised. So, Shaban, you.
Yeah, about mediation. But before that, actually, I want to respond to your point about the collapse of the compartmentalization. Just your comment about Iraq, Syria. 2015 was a major stress test. It wasn't a failure of compartmentalized relationship. The way I personally see, we have seen the limits, how precarious the relationship we built with Russia and the risk of undermining it. And both sides were quick to come back to common sense and manage it. Management of such a major crisis, downing of the Russian debt, was a major stress test, and that relationship passed that test, and that's why the experience in Syria and Iraq was a contributing factor. In response to your question, yes, indeed, and the Astana, as a matter of fact, Astana was such a platform that if you operate in such a congested theater, so close with clashing interests and militarized this conflict, of course, there is always a risk. What do you need? You need to develop a mechanism for de-escalation, managing the tensions. And Astana was, in that respect, an instrument to tone down the tensions. And as a matter of fact, we have another compartmentalized relation, which is with Iran. We were together in Iran, right? And then we see also in the Syrian context, there was a risk that this compartmentalized Turkey-Iranian relationship was put under pressure because of potential conflict. And Astana helped manage it. So in that sense, I think a bit differently. Yes, the partnership there was helping Turkey move forward. And as a matter of fact, I remember when there was in Antalya G20 summit, President Erdogan openly said, when I raised my concerns about Syria, President Obama didn't care, didn't respond, but President Putin was more responsive, at least. So in a sense that management of compartmentalized relationship allowed Turkey to expand some of its options in the Syrian context. This is a good example in that respect. I just wanted to emphasize. Regarding the mediation, to me, the real question is not whether Turkish mediation can work, what do we need in the crisis? Where do we add in the crisis? Leave aside Turkey. So what is the nature of the current crisis? Is it ripe for mediation? This is the kind of question we need to ask. And of course, you need to respond, who drives the crisis? Who has the upper hand? Okay, we all want to have mediation, but is Putin really interested in mediation? Then the rest, to me, is not important. It reminded me in the Lord of the Rings movie at the beginning, Gandalf says about the Gollum, poor Frodo wants to get rid of, and he says he has a role to play in this thing, and at the end he plays his own. So, as Yun said, Turkey has a role to play, but the question we need to ask, what kind of a role, depending on the nature of the crisis itself. So at this point, the mediation, you remember actually just before the outbreak of the hostilities, conflict, President Erdogan suggested that he will bring together. It didn't work because the parties, especially the main initiator of the conflict, isn't interested. So in that sense, at this point, it is irrelevant. But assuming that we reached to that stage where now it's time for mediation, still, the way Putin acted in 2008, 2014, I don't think he would be willing to let Turkey play that role as well. So he may want to talk to the quote-unquote West directly than Turkey's mediation, but it depends on the conditions under which the conflict will evolve, and we will reach a stage where what really is needed is actually mediation.
Thank you very much. Alki, you had a question, and then I think Happy Ben, you can conclude. Yes.
Okay, I mean, what I said was related to the problematic that was introduced between the exceptionalism and uniqueness. So in the Greek case, I mean, you have the 100% of the media repeating every day that a new Turkish provocation and then going on to state a normal fact of life. But that makes it an official or a dominant message, which is totally discredited. Nobody believes that. I mean, despite the fact that it's on the top of the news, and despite the fact that if an observer was putting that in numbers, I mean, he would have concluded that this is we are close to war. I mean, the opposite happens in Turkey, and I think that in Turkey the official or dominant message, because I don't want to get into how these messages are, it's much more credible and much more going deeper, I mean, in the conscience. But this again is it's a part of a cultural debate that hasn't been. It has much more greater repercussions because it has never finished. This is part of, I mean, this conversation started with the clash of civilization, where the clash is between Christians and Muslims, but the Orthodox Christians are classified with the Muslims. So this is a problem there. I mean, there are nuances that we haven't yet studied, and we need to get deeper to that to understand. I mean, how these things are functioning.
Thank you very much, and Habibe, you have the last word.
Two questions that I'm going to mention. I'll try to answer. In terms of change of government in Turkey, I would probably say that Russia is an important player in many aspects, from energy to in terms of bilateral relations to economy, tourism, etc. So specific areas cooperation in specific areas will continue 100%. Russia is going to continue to be an important player, but there are some other areas where leader-to-leader relations were very important. This is going to change, and most probably we are going to see much more institutional relations, which we do lack now. The end of compartmentalization mostly is due to the lack of institutions. So therefore, institutions, their place, foreign ministry, for example, is going to play a much more role. Let me give you another example. Mersin Akkuyu nuclear power plant was signed by an agreement between governments. It never came to the parliament in Turkey. So this sort of, bypassing institutions, initiatives are going to be much more and then we may see institutions. Of course, Turkey's relations with deteriorating relations with West may change, but once again, the importance of Russia is there, and it's going to stay there. Some areas will change, but continuity, we also are going to see continuity. In terms of Syria and Libya, I believe, yes, compartmentalization definitely, 2015 is an important area, but let me also remind you that Turkey-Russia relations after 2015, in terms of Syria, it was only possible to cooperate once Turkey's priorities has changed in Syria, from toppling down the regime to preventing PYD-controlled area in Syria. So let's also not forget this part of it. So yes, there are definitely going to be Syria in part of Syria. Since Russia is a player in that region, 1 September 2015 is a turning point. Turkey saw that it is Russia who is on area, so who is Turkey to deal with? Bearing all that in mind, we may definitely expect Turkey-Russia synergy to continue on that specific area.
Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our speakers for a very interesting discussion.